And here we go. Okay, so as you know, Helen Daly-Fisher, convener, Equality Rights Alliance. For those who are joining us on the recording, the people who are participating in this session today, this is probably the third session for most of them today, and so we're all pretty familiar with each other by now. I'm coming to you from the lands of the Ngunnawal people, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and I extend those respects to people viewing this video and participating today who are from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families. I am privileged to be from a community from lands where language is being reclaimed and disseminated. So I say to you all, Yumalundi, welcome to this session on how to internationalise your domestic issue. So the basic idea in this session is that you're a domestic advocate, you're somebody who does work in Australia, you are pretty much on top of your subject matter, you know how to do your advocacy here, but you're about to take it into an international environment. And the question is, how do you make what you want to say about what's happening in Australia relevant to people out there? And how do you get it to line up with international processes like language negotiation and that sort of thing? So we're going to work through a couple of practical examples and do a little bit of work on how you do it as a matter of practice, but also about the sort of conceptual ideas underneath it. And I guess the big thing to keep in mind when you're moving from the international to the domestic is to remember the same thing that you do when you're doing domestic advocacy, which is to understand very clearly what it is you're trying to achieve. When you can do that, when you know what your aim is in participating in the international process, then it becomes much easier for you to cut through the enormous amount of information that you're going to get by moving into the international space. Because one of the things that is a feature of the international space is that most issues have been thought through very carefully by lots of different people in lots of different contexts. And so there's usually a wealth of information about any subject you care to poke a stick at. On the other hand, we're also seeing new issues popping up quite rapidly. And so participating in the public space is a really good way of starting to build your networks for people who are working on the issues that are coming up rapidly. So that you're able to access the sort of information you might need as an advocate here in Australia from international thinkers as they're dealing with these issues too. The big example of that for me was participating in CSW last year, where the theme was climate change and gender equality. And just being involved in that process and finding the time to sit and listen to advocates from around the world introduced me to concepts that simply hadn't come across my desk previously, but which in the last 12 months have suddenly become quite important. So issues like data sovereignty, which hadn't turned up for me previously, suddenly became critical when we're talking about issues like gender responsive budgeting in Australia, because we're talking about how important it is to get good granular data, but we also need to ask the question about, well, who holds that data and who owns it? So there are huge advantages to working in this international space and direct advantages back to the work that you'll be doing in Australia. But there is a little bit of work to be done in the early stages, simply around conceptualising how you explain what it is you want to say in the international context. So the first thing to get your head around is the issue of the language. So we have a couple of different categories of language to keep your mind on when you're doing international work. The first is the concept of previously agreed language. Previously agreed language, in a way, is the easiest bit to get your head around. This is the language that has appeared ideally in intra or interstate peer negotiated documents from the UN or from other bodies. So you might be talking about an APEC or a G20 outcomes document. You might be talking about the agreed conclusions of the Commission on the Status of Women. You might be talking about comments from the Human Rights Council. Documents and agreements that have been either negotiated through consensus or which have signatories are really useful to get your head around, because they represent, in a way, the current baseline standard in the issue you're interested in. And we'll come back to that a little bit more later. The other bits of language to be aware of is terms of accepted usage. And this can get a little bit tricky. One of the things that is really good to do early on in your journey to the international space is to start to understand what special terms keep coming up. So, for example, climate refugee is a term that has quite a specific set of understandings and definitions behind it in the international space, whereas we use it a little bit more sort of loosely as a bit of a catchy term to describe a problem rather than a carefully defined term. And so understanding what the accepted usage language in your area is quite a useful first step. Terms of art are similar, but they're more often carefully defined and written down. So you can find out what terms of art mean, usually by Googling what does blah mean, and you'll come up with some sort of official definition. Whereas terms of accepted usage, often you need to talk to people and do a bit of reading before you start to get a sense of where the boundaries of that term are. One thing to note at this point is that when you're looking at particularly documents that are agreements between states, they'll often start with a big section that says recalling blah and reiterating that blah. And that section at the beginning of an international agreement or an international a statement of some kind is the bit which does that work around accepted use in terms of art, because it tells you which documents the people who signed up to that statement were thinking of when they used this particular term or that particular term. So CSW agreed conclusions always start with recalling or reiterating the Beijing Platform for Action and the outcomes of the Fifth World Convention on Women. And the reason they're doing that is because when you read the rest of the document, they want you to bear in mind all the definitions and the information that's contained in the Beijing Platform for Action. That forms the context for understanding the words in the document you're reading in front of you. We'll go into that a lot more for those who are going to participate in the meetings that I'm doing in New York, in particular, pardon me, the Tuesday morning one. But it's worth knowing that a familiarity with the core documents in your area is a good idea. You don't have to know it off by heart, but having got a sense of them is good, because it tells you which documents you would like to see referenced in that early part of the agreed conclusions, which might help to do some definitional work, particularly using terms like sexual and reproductive rights or that sort of thing. You might be referring to documents from the UN Body on Population and Development in order to expand the definition beyond what you could get into the actual CSW document. So there's language in your particular area of interest. And then there are the national and regional contexts for your issue. I'm going to use housing as the example for this initial bit, which makes Rachel giggle because I think that's going to be her area. But if we're looking at housing, we've got a variety of different levels. Within Australia, anyone working on housing knows that you've got to be thinking about local government and its role in planning laws and land use. You've got to be thinking about state government, which has primary responsibility for the provision of public housing and the coordination of community housing. And you've got to be thinking about the federal government as the primary driver for a national led approach to affordable housing, and also as the primary funder for affordable housing in Australia. And so there are those three national contexts, even when you're just thinking about the government levels involved. You might also have the context of local community organisations that are involved in making decisions about what housing is built where. Then there are the regional contexts. And if you think about something like housing, housing in the Pacific, for example, on Pacific Islands, looks very different as an issue to the way it looks in Australia. And so starting to grapple with that issue, that context, is a good place to begin to think about how you can identify which parts of your advocacy are going to be most interest to people from your region, but outside your national context. And then from there, extrapolating out to what's going to be of most interest to people from around the world. So understanding the regional context for the work you're doing is quite important. And then the other thing to keep in mind is privilege, access and opportunities to promote. So how do you use our undoubtedly privileged position as people currently advocating in an environment where the federal government in particular is strongly supportive of a lot of the work that we're doing? Whether they implement it right or not, we'll wait and see. But we hold various levels of privilege and agency within our own context, which, while we might be acknowledging our own privilege locally, might manifest differently internationally. So there might be layers of privilege that you need to acknowledge in yourself and in the work you do and in your context that we wouldn't consider to be privilege in Australia, but which when you take it out into an international context suddenly becomes critically important. I'm going to just pop some slides up so that you can see a slide that I've prepared, which uses that housing issue as an example of the way the sort of things that we talk about in Australia might look a little bit different when we take them internationally. So when we talk about housing in Australia, we tend to talk about affordability. We talk about appropriateness of the housing or accessibility. We talk about the linkages between available housing and appropriate housing and gendered violence, and housing as a pathway out of gendered violence. We talk about disasters and climate change. We talk about the lack of investment in social housing over a period of time. We talk about the market drivers of unaffordability, that tax debate, the question of whether or not we should have programs for assisted first home buyers, that sort of thing. We talk about gendered poverty. We talk about accessing finance, and we talk about discrimination. All of those things are concepts that anyone working in housing in Australia will be really familiar with. But when you take them internationally, they look a little bit different. So if you're talking to a housing advocate internationally, you might be talking to someone who works on the right to own property for women. You might be talking to somebody who works on inheritance rights and whether or not women can inherit land. You might be talking to people who are working on forced slum clearance, forced relocation, gendered poverty, accessing finance, the linkages with gendered violence, discrimination. You might be talking about the links between housing and HIV/AIDS, particularly around discrimination. You might be talking about disasters and climate change, investment in social housing and development. And what's interesting about those two lists is that there's quite a lot of crossover. The actual manifestation won't be the same in each context, but the general subjects you'll be talking about have a fair amount of crossover. So in Australia, we have a particular history of a lack of investment in social housing over the past 20, 30 years, whereas lack of investment in social housing in another context might be about the fact that it's never been done. And so you might be talking about the same issue in slightly different ways, but those crossover areas are the areas that it will be most fruitful for you to be pursuing when you're in an international context. So step one for you is to write down, what are my domestic asks, and where are they occurring in the stuff that I'm reading that I think that I could usefully leverage as I go through this work. So the way to take that next step and say, all right, well, how do I get into the position where I can do that exercise, is to firstly know your domestic position well. And that's what I was talking about a moment ago, where I said, know what it is that you want to achieve, what it is that you're trying to achieve domestically, and why it is that you're engaging internationally. If you've got those two things pinned down, the amount of reading you need to do becomes a lot lighter. One thing you don't want to be doing is having to do the reading to work out the answers to those two questions. Work from where you are, work from what it is that you're hoping to achieve domestically, and then move from that into, so why am I moving into an international space in order to achieve those things? Google, it's your friend. This work used to be an awful lot harder before you could just Google it. Nowadays, it is much, much easier to get your head around what the language is in your area and what the key issues are. The original Beijing Platform for Action, I think we've got Juliana on the line who was there at the conference where that document was negotiated, has only recently been put online in a searchable form. It was previously a PDF of a typed document, which tells you how quickly this has happened. In the lifetime of the document that we are trying to implement, we have moved from you really need to know someone to get a copy of this document to you're going to be able to find pretty much everything you need online somewhere. So read the work on your issue across different regions. Start with your local region and move outward from there, depending on what sort of international environment you're moving into. So if you were going, for example, to a regional caucus meeting of the Asia Pacific region under SCAP or something similar, you might decide that what you really want to do is focus on your reading on the Pacific area and then do some reading around the broader Asia area to help you get a sense of what it is that other people will be bringing to the table. If you're going to CSW, you probably want to have a sense of what's coming up in the EU, what's coming up in Latin America, and what's coming up in Africa and Asia as the four really big movers, and understanding, possibly to a slightly lesser extent, what's happening in the US. The United States is also a good step. You skim this stuff. You're not aiming to become an expert. So this is really about headlines, and if you can find executive summaries, use those because you're not going to be able to read everything in detail until you find that thing that lines up with what it is that you want to achieve domestically and internationally. And that's where you start to pay more attention and read in depth. Keep notes and lists of the terms you're coming across and notes about your understanding of the definitions of those terms. And then you can check those with other people who are doing similar work. One of the reasons why we put such an effort into getting the CSW representatives from Australia together and talking to each other, particularly in New York, is so that people who are working on similar issues can get together and say, when I talk about an issue like reparations, climate damage, is this what's meant by that phrase? And we can exchange information. So it becomes really important to be able to do that. And then when you're over there, to network in such a way that you find people you can trust to also ask those questions of from other regions, to sort of stress test your understanding of the areas. So use your networks. Within Australia, you will have people in your networks who've done work internationally, even though you might not realise it, or at the very least, you'll know people who know people. Getting somebody who can do that extra job that Google's not always great at and say, oh, well, actually, in that area, what I'd be working on is this, or what I'd be reading is this. Ask people to send you things and then skim read them to see whether or not you think they're core for you or not. But start to build yourself a map of the language in the area and the key issues in the area from an international perspective. What are the things that are likely to be talked about? Adopt the international terms where you can, so that you start to get used to them, but be prepared to switch back again when you want to move into the domestic environment. So being able to use a little bit of flexibility in the way you move between the language you use is something to start with. But when you're just starting on this journey, using the international terms is actually a good way to get used to them. And as a default, look for the human rights language and the language of the Beijing Platform for Action. Sustainable Development Goals, also useful. But those looking for the relevant human rights treaties, the relevant human rights, and the relevant parts of the Beijing Platform for Action are a really good place to start because that will then, apart from anything else, give you some of your search terms for the broader reading. The other thing is interrogate your assumptions and your standards. It might be that you get into the international environment and discover that the thing that you really, really wanted to talk about might not be the most important thing to talk about, and that your job might actually be to bring something back to Australia that you hadn't anticipated. So be prepared to be an envoy, be prepared to be an ally, and be prepared to be someone who will open doors for other people. One of the things that's really important for us going into an international space is that the aim is to be insisting on high standards for everyone. Participation in the international space is above all about raising the baseline standard across the board. And so insisting on high standards of language, high standards of negotiated outcomes is something that we do both for ourselves and that we do to support our sisters across the world. That's a huge jump to begin with. Any questions before I go leaping onwards? Just feel free to jump off mute. Cool. In that case, I'll charge onwards. But if you do think of questions, do just come off mute and interrupt me at any time, because we're going to move into a bit of nitty-gritty on how you would go about actually doing that Google search if you were doing housing. So using that principle that we start with the human rights language, and I will just say the reason we start with the human rights language is because other people won't. And in particular, states will forget to use a human rights framework. That happens here as much as anywhere else. I came out of a meeting with a federal department I won't name, who administer a strategy relating to women, and asked them had they mapped it against human rights. And it was like I'd asked them, had they ever married an alien? It was just not something they'd ever considered. So that question of always starting from the human rights position is really critical, because there is a lot of pressure to ignore human rights in international processes, just as there is in the Australian context. So starting from that human rights basis, we start with the idea of where the rights to housing sit within our framework. And so Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the grandmother of all the human rights documents, starts in Article 25 with everyone has the right to a standard of living which is adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family, including, amongst other things, housing. That's where it comes from originally. And you follow on then into the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, Article 1.1, which reads the right of everyone to an adequate standard of living for himself and his family, including adequate food, clothing and housing, and to the continuous improvement of living conditions. That's Article 11.1. And so that's the basic framework for where you would start in your Google search. So, and that's an easy search. That is right to housing, human right to housing, and off you go. There will be lots and lots of lovely articles saying the right to housing is based on, and you just skim that stuff. And then once you've got those core elements written down, they become the basis of your searches from then. So Beijing Platform for Action, if we're looking specifically for the gendered aspect and possibly for a treaty that doesn't refer to human beings as himself, you go to paragraph 58M, which says states will enable women to obtain affordable housing and access to land by, amongst other things, removing all obstacles to access, with special emphasis on meeting the needs of women, especially those living in poverty and female heads of household. And you can see right there that instantly there are aspects of that right which read differently in Australia, how they might internationally. The issue about female heads of household initially feels like it might be, an issue in highly patriarchal cultures where female heads of households are not necessarily recognised with legal status. But when you stop and think about it, you can start to apply that to the work that we do here in Australia. Whenever I hear, especially those living in poverty and female heads of household, I think of the work of the National Council of Single Mothers and Their Children. I think about the Parents Next program, and I think about the high levels of poverty the single mothers on the single parent payment are in. I mean, there's instant applicability, even though the language initially isn't the sort of language that we use. Then the other thing to always check is whether there's a gendered piece that comes directly out of CSW. And the nice thing about that in the CSW context is that originally CSW's job was to first build CSW and then get it implemented. And then its job was to implement the Beijing Platform for Action, which was building it itself on CSW, which is the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. International work is full of acronyms. Forgive me if I don't spell them out, but if you don't know one I'm using, please do ask. And so CSW Article 14.2H says, states parties shall take all appropriate measures to eliminate discrimination against women in rural areas in order to ensure, on a basis of equality, that they participate in and benefit from rural development, and in particular shall ensure to such women the right, H, to enjoy adequate living standards, particularly in relation to housing. And so that's actually a really, really specific right, specifically relating to women in rural areas. So CSW only gives us a right to non-discrimination for other areas of housing, but does have that one provision specifically for rural women. So it's worth chasing those lines down to make sure that the key human rights documents don't contain something that might actually be quite relevant to you, because if your work on housing is about, for example, women in rural, regional or remote areas, or about women on Pacific Islands, or about women living on country, that particular right might be the one that you're hanging on to more than the Beijing Platform for Action, for example. So it might depend on where you are, which one of the human rights you decide to highlight and work for. So if we take that human rights context and go back to our domestic vision, let's say that what you're advocating for in Australia is that the federal government must consult on the housing needs and barriers faced by a diverse range of women when they develop the National Housing and Homelessness Strategy, which we're hearing about at the moment. So what we're asking for is that they get the consultation right. And we'd have all sorts of definitions around what we mean about that. So intersectionality being properly recognised in that process, diverse women's voices, victim survivors being clearly heard in that process. Depending on sort of who we're speaking to, we would have a range of different ways of framing that ask. But that would be the core that we'll consider here. Your international version might look slightly different, because a lot of what you're doing in the international space is asking states to do stuff. And so states must develop national housing strategies, which reflect a process of extensive, genuine consultation with a broad diversity of women, particularly women facing multiple and intersectional disadvantage. And what I've done there is I've used italics to highlight the terms of art or terms with accepted usage that you might have come across in your reading if you were doing the research around this. So national housing strategies, there's a whole literature around what constitutes a good national housing strategy. And there are various different UN agreements, UN documents, special rapporteur reports from various different poverty and housing related rapporteurs, which set out what a national housing strategy should look like, what the recommendations are for it, and so on. And so when you're doing this work, you would want to have those to hand so that you can start to talk to people about, well, if we're saying states must develop national housing strategies, not just any national housing strategy, a proper one, this is what we mean. Process of genuine extensive consultation, that wording might come from somewhere else entirely. Once you get a little bit more experienced in using international language, particularly across a number of different areas, you can start to import language from one area and use it in another. Where states have already accepted a concept of extensive, genuine consultation being an important thing, say in the climate area or in the health sector, you can start to use that language as previously agreed language, even though it's not necessarily coming out of the gender space or coming out of the housing space. If it's widely understood, you can start to import it across barriers. And then women facing multiple and intersectional disadvantage. This is one you'll see at CSW. It's one of the first things to get struck out. Australia does a really good job of fighting to get it back in. Alongside that term, this time around what we're seeing is gender transformative interventions is the other phrase where that language is being struck out. But you might want to take your international version of housing and transform it to say states must develop national housing strategies which provide gender transformative opportunities, something like that, to import the language that's specifically coming out of the forum that we're talking about. So any questions about any of that? No one's drowning? Well done. Okay, so having a look at the priority theme for CSW, you're all going to have different versions of this. And in a minute, I'll ask anyone if they want to volunteer the area that they want to have a look at. But some of the things that are coming up in this area that occur within the Australian domestic context and are actively being discussed here are access to assistive tech, particularly in relation to health, but also in relation to disability. Healthcare generally and accessibility, and we've had those debates around telehealth and Medicare numbers and around how you access medical services when you are in a rural, regional or remote area, particularly around sexual and reproductive rights and around access to abortion. So those are the live versions of this in Australia. Access to complex care like cancer care when you're living outside a major metropolitan area, that sort of thing. Public participation is a really big debate in Australia, although interestingly, I've used the international language there, which is an interesting slip by me, because in Australia, we don't generally call it that. We generally talk about it in terms of harm. And so when we talk about the ability of a young woman to take a job in Parliament as part of a career, which is about being being actively involved in our political process, who then experiences sexual assault in her workplace, we tend to talk about that in terms of the harm implications in Australia. But internationally, we might talk about it in terms of the limitation on the right to public participation, which is set out in CEDAW. So there may be different ways to frame what you're talking about. And sometimes bringing that framing back into Australia is really useful. I haven't seen much discussion about Brittany Higgins as somebody whose right to participate in public discourse in Australia was significantly compromised by an unsafe workplace. But that's a breach of human rights, just as much as being subject to cruel and unusual behaviour and torture is, which is where you put assault. And so, yeah, we're talking multiple breaches of human rights, and maybe we should be naming them. In line with that, digitally facilitated abuse, harassment, and then the issue of data sovereignty, which I was talking about, which is a live issue, particularly around who's collecting information about housing in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in Australia. How much of that information is then being handed to other government departments? And that's a really live question, because we've just had the Workplace Gender Equality Agency have a review, which has recommended that the government work to try to work out how they can pull information from other government departments, including the tax office, to make WGEA reporting simpler. Now, if you're working for an Aboriginal corporation in a small community and you are easily identifiable by your data, that has ramifications that might not be visible on the face of that recommendation, despite the fact that, broadly speaking, we would support that recommendation because it tends to move towards reducing the wage gap. So these issues are very live in Australia and will be manifesting differently in different environments. The right to privacy, we talked about in the last session today at some length. Affordability of tech and access in rural, regional and remote areas. Economic empowerment. Renewable energy, particularly around getting women into the renewable energy sector and women's access to renewable energy. And then women in STEM, both in education and employment. Internationally, quite a lot of that is looking very similar. The ones that are framed a little bit differently is the poverty reduction piece. We tend to talk in terms of affordability and accessibility in Australia, and then in terms of women's economic development and maybe gendered poverty. Internationally, we might be talking about poverty reduction and poverty reduction for women and girls. Clean energy, slightly different phrasing internationally. Increasing militarisation and tech, and the interaction between the two is an issue that's coming up there. But then we heard from Ludmilla in the last session today about how that's very well and truly apparent in Australian communities as well. Tech as an education enabler is a really big one internationally because it allows particularly developing nations to be able to provide specialised education across broad areas and out into communities where access is limited for face-to-face education. So things are manifesting a little bit differently, but what's most interesting about the difference between the domestic version of digital advocacy and the international version is that the international version is much more sophisticated in terms of its broader analysis of capitalism and colonial practices and ongoing colonial practices in particular. The international discussion about practices in northern states, north versus south, and be aware that when the discussion about north versus south happens, Australia is considered north, which is partly why we sit in the Western Europe and others group, because culturally and structurally we're sitting in a similar political and economic system to the northern states. Tax and financing for development are big issues that are coming up as well, which you'll hear much more about in the digital advocacy space internationally than you will here in Australia. And the discussion around monopolies and around transparency and access to information about development processes is also more developed internationally than it is here in Australia. I'll stop there for a moment because from here on I'll move into something that's a bit more CSW focused. But has anyone got an issue that they're working on in Australia that they'd like to sort of have a little go at workshopping here? It'll be a pretty rough go, but we'll give it a whirl. Anyone interested in one? I've stolen yours, Rach, because we've already done housing.
I really appreciated that, Helen. That was really helpful.
Speaking of which, is there a particular aspect of housing that the Y will be taking CSW?
It's a really good question that I do not have the answer to.
Cool. These things are often worked out quite close to the departure date. Certainly my stuff is still getting sorted out. Bree, what's Chief Executive Women taking?
Hi, everyone. So we're largely focusing on disaggregated data and how it can help map women's leadership and have a bit more transparency in the private sector.
Fantastic. That's actually a really useful one, particularly in the context of the digital space, because it's one where the human rights framework is not well articulated. And so you've got to take a step down from we need to collect data and ask what are the reasons why we need to collect the data. We need to collect the data in order to be able to address discrimination. And so suddenly you're sitting in CEDAW and the various articles that relate to public participation when we're talking about leadership is where you'd go there. And so you'd start your search in relation to data, but you'd look at data and human rights. So if you're somebody to whom the human rights framework is a bit new, you literally start with a search of data, human rights basis, take it back to that, and then move forward from there. And so you'd be looking at a whole range of really interesting issues there. The data sovereignty, how you collect, who gets collected, who controls it, are going to be really interesting issues there. And so if we took that issue and we're looking for, and Bree's done a really good job of articulating a general position, which would appeal very broadly internationally, because that's going to resonate in a lot of countries. What you might be trying to identify is which nations have done really interesting work in this area, particularly those who have done it in different circumstances to us. And so the one that springs to my mind is the Parliament of South Sudan, which is very new, and which has a very high proportion of female members, because they've come out of a conflict environment where they've had a process that involved women being involved in peace processes. Not in any way saying that it's been a good process or a perfect process, but it would be really interesting to hear from women in that environment about what sort of data is being collected around women leadership in that space. And that might be particularly interesting coming back to Australia, because you might be able to then say, well, if we're in a situation where some of our infrastructure is going to break down because we're going to face a high level of climate-related disaster activity over the next few years, we might need to know how this stuff is done in places that doesn't have infrastructure in place. Is that useful information to us? And so that might be a way of you starting conversations with people who on first blush look like they're not talking about the same work that we do. And then you extrapolate that through to women CEOs and so on. Whereas your conversation with the EU might look very different. It might be, how do you overcome the issues around data sovereignty when you've got such a centralised system for data collection? So you would be doing some pretty broad reading on that one, but then thinking about, well, what would be useful for us to bring back to Australia, where we know what sort of central agencies we've got currently for the collection of data. How do we move from where we are to where we need to be on the collection of data? Do we need new agencies? Do we need to better empower the ones we've got? Do we need to give them different instructions? So that's a sort of a very rough view of how that might evolve. The other thing I would suggest is that you're open to serendipity once you get into the international space. That moment for me is always recalls an event I went to sort of because the one I'd wanted to get to filled up and I couldn't get into it. And it was the old chestnut that you always see at CSW, which is clean fuel and safe cooking in communities for women. And I remember sitting there thinking, this is fascinating and I'm loving hearing about what women are doing in other countries, but this really doesn't apply to Australia. And then stopping and thinking, hang on, I went to a school where all the gas heaters were unflued. And how many kids sitting in rural and remote schools nowadays are still sitting with inadequate heating that can't be turned on because it's not ventilated, and suddenly realising that this issue that I thought was applied to people over there actually had occurred in my life. And so being open to serendipity and being very flexible in your thinking about how these things apply in our daily life can start to open up really interesting conversations in your own head and with others. Anything else anyone would like to add at that point, or?
Nothing I'd probably like to add, Helen. I've just got a quick question. Is there ever going to be a drive to be able to simplify and change some of the language that the UN is using, just to make it a lot more accessible for the people that it's actually impacting on?
There's actually a whole movement around translation, and that is actually a critical role that perhaps we should be doing more in Australia. I think we've got a very poorly developed human rights discourse in Australia. I'm in an individual capacity part of a campaign to try to actually get us a Human Rights Act in this country, and we are very bad at talking about human rights. And so when we then get agreed conclusions document that takes 14 lines to get to the point of saying states will stop setting up systems that abuse women, we're faced with a fairly major problem. The reason the language is that complicated is for a number of reasons, actually. One of them is the translation issues across the 5 official languages at the UN. And coming together with a language that everybody can understand, because it's been the language before, and that's why agreed language is such a big thing. Another critical piece is that the language is often incredibly nuanced. And Ludmilla, I'm going to come to you in just a moment on this. No, I'm not. I'm going to come to you now, and then I'll go and show you an example of that nuanced language. Ludmilla.
Helps. I'm having trouble with my connection, so it's been a bit rough at the moment. Just to say 100% on that, and I was actually probably going to go the next step after you show the complications, and saying that maybe in our debrief after CSW, we can do a, in quotes, big translation for people as a part of a debrief, where we translate it into maybe even not necessarily the Australian context specifically, but the language, the use of the language as well. Yeah, I've often thought of that. I've had to do that for my own organisations, who, when I've given them a copy of the outcome statement, have said to me, "We don't understand what's in this, so you have to do it anyway. So why don't we do it at some point?" Not that I'm trying to give you more work, Helen.
No, that's actually a great
you.
idea. Imagine, Ludmilla, if we could get enough people to take 4 paragraphs each. And map it against the Australian environment and rewrite it in English, in Australian English, because
actually that would be good.
Wouldn't that be fun? Yeah. Okay. Mapping that one in my head. Because the issue that we've got is that when we're trying to say we've got housing internationally, and we're trying to encapsulate the issues that apply in each different region and each different national context, we tend to use shorthand terms. And that's why the language gets so incredibly involved, and why they can't write a sentence that doesn't have 9 bits of punctuation in it. And so because they are negotiated documents, they're traded backwards and forwards. And Kaylee, you're going to see this at the very pointy end, because Kaylee's on the government delegation. But I'm going to go back to the slide to give you some examples of this so that it makes a little bit more sense. While I talk about it making sense, what I mean is that you'll understand how we got there, but that doesn't mean it's a good thing for us to be preserving. So let's look at the phrase SRHR, which is what everybody will bark about when they're in CSW. They'll say, oh, we don't have enough SRHR in that paragraph. They mean sexual and reproductive health rights. But then some people will say SRH and R, and they will mean sexual and reproductive health, as in having access to health care and having your sexual and reproductive human rights. And so they're actually bundling a whole lot of important bits of information about what is meant in that particular paragraph into their choice of formulation of words. One of the things you will see happen in the negotiation room, which we will hear about happening in the negotiation room, so you don't get to see it, will be that the word sexual will get dropped. The word reproductive and health will get retained, and the word rights will get dropped. And that's because there is a strong push against women having sexual rights. There will be people in the negotiation room who do not think that women have a right to say no, and that consent is not a thing. There will be people in the room who read sexual rights as being code for sexual orientation and gender identity, i.e. trans, LGBTI. And so the choice of words is determined not by how understandable it is and how well it communicates the concept. It's determined by the agendas that are sitting behind the negotiation. So you'll hear SOGI is another term you'll hear, or SOGI-esque. The progressive group that I work with, the Women's Rights Caucus, use SOGI-esque because it stands for sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression and sex characteristics. So that covers anybody who is trans, anybody who is intersex, It emphasises the manifestation of gender alongside sex characteristics. That issue around sex and gender I'll come back to in a moment. You'll hear lots of language around civil society and women's organisations. We sometimes get the phrase feminist organisations in. That means something different to women's organisations. Women's organisations means organisations generally of women who may have a progressive or a conservative agenda, or no political agenda at all, simply exists to supply a service. Feminist organisations are presumed to be progressive organisations looking to make structural change. The debate around women's human rights versus women's rights. And I think I was mentioning earlier to Kaylee that I once saw my boss, Caroline Lambert, my boss at the time, corner the papal nuncio, which is the chief negotiator for the Vatican in the room at CSW, literally corner him, got him in a corner, and asked him to explain why it is that the Vatican wants to remove the word human from women's human rights. And eventually, after talking around it for a while and realising that she was not going to let him walk away, he explained that there is a hierarchy of rights under God, and that there are human rights, and there are the rights of the family, and then there are women's rights. And that some of the human rights apply to women, but that the rights of women are subservient to those of the family. And so you will see people fighting to include the word human in that phrase to emphasise the universality of human rights and the universality of women's rights, and to undermine that idea that there is some sort of hierarchy going on here. Women and girls, you'll see people fighting to remove the word girls. You'll see people fighting to include the word adolescents. You'll see young women used. The ideal formulation at our end will be women, young women, and girls, and people of diverse genders. We're not going to get that last bit in for many decades. People of diverse genders is a long way from where we are now. We fight to keep women and girls. Russia in particular does not like girls. As far as they're concerned, girls are subject to the authority of their fathers until they marry, at which point they either become women or remain subject to the authority of their husbands. And so you'll see them be perfectly happy for the word girl to be in a paragraph on healthcare, but remove the word girls from anything that implies that girls should be involved in consultation or co-design, or that they should be in some sort of leadership role. And so you start to get a sense of the fact that when these documents are drafted, they're not about communication. And so Kaylee's raised a really important point about, well, then what's our role in terms of doing that interpretation that Miller is talking about? How is it that we can make this make more sense? One that I think we're winning on at the moment and may not need to keep fighting on is Indigenous women, language around Indigenous and First Nations women and Indigenous and First Nations people is better understood and accepted now than it was 5 years ago. 5 years ago, the African bloc would routinely say, we are all Indigenous. This language doesn't mean anything to us. It's niche. And fortunately, there was a very strong North American, South American bloc that was supported by strong work from the Pacific and Australia that did the educative work needed to make it clear, in particular to a number of the states in Africa, that they actually do have Indigenous populations which can be described as Indigenous and which have experienced colonial history, which are not necessarily recognised in their populations. And so work around that has come a long way over the past 5 years. And right now, I would say that's one of the most fertile areas for us making progress in the language. And Kaylee, because that's new language and youthful, there is space for us to try to emphasise readability and understandability in that. and to try to minimise caveats and clauses in those paragraphs. So I think there's an opportunity there. Little things like the use of the term family. There will be people fighting for the family, text about the family. And when they say the family, they mean the nuclear family, one male, one cis male, one cis female, and children of that union. Australia plays a really important role in that debate because the underlying tension there is primarily around same-sex couples and around transgender people being allowed to form families that are legally recognised. And Australia is able to talk about Aboriginal kinship systems and around Pacific region kinship systems, and to point out that the idea of the family is in fact a fiction, and that if we're going to properly represent women in the world, we have to be talking about families. Ideally, we'd be talking about families in all their diversity, but most of the time we settle for families as a recognition that at least there's more than one. You'll hear people barking stressfully about CSE, comprehensive sexuality education. Comprehensive sexuality education is one of those terms of art that has a huge amount of meaning behind it. It's not tremendously important that you're across all of that, except that if it's your area of focus, it might be useful to get a sense of it, but you really don't need to become an expert on it. Suffice to say that it is about sexuality education rather than reproductive education. It covers things like pleasure and consent and respectful relationships. It covers all human experiences, so LGBTI experiences. It covers experiences in different cultural contexts, and the key elements of it. But also that it is delivered in a way that is accessible and which is age appropriate and maturity appropriate. Often those last two are what help us to get that language in. We usually manage to score one reference to it in the agreed conclusions. It'd be great if we could push that up to 2, but the fact that we're even keeping score rather than saying it's relevant in this paragraph is concerning. So let's keep an eye on that. Another one you might hear people talk about is NHRIs, National Human Rights Institutions. That's things like the Australian Human Rights Commission. So it's where there is a national body which ideally should be independent of government. And there's a system of ratings for NHRIs, which I think is largely overseen by the Human Rights Council, which rates bodies as being of different standards depending on what their structure is and how they behave, what sort of support they get in country. So Australia was threatened with its National Human Rights Institution, the Human Rights Commission, losing its status as an A+ institution back when we had the debate between Gillian Trigg and the government around interference in the work of the Commission. There is a push at CSW always to try to get national human rights institutions a seat at the table at CSW. At the moment, they don't have a formal seat, and that's why it's significant that the Australian government takes the Sex Discrimination Commissioner and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commissioner to CSW because they represent our NHRI in CSW, despite the fact that they don't technically have a seat at the table. Australia gives them one. Just quickly, a couple of others. Intersectionality. You'll very rarely hear the term intersectional. Multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination is the phrase you more often see. And that one's one that often they try to carve it down to diversity, which is not the same thing. Then sometimes we devolve into a discussion of the list. And the list is whether you list older women, young women, LGBTI people, women in rural, regional and remote areas, women with disability, Indigenous First Nations people, whether you do the list and say you must supply this especially to and list, or whether you say to women and girls in all their diversity. Some people prefer the list for visibility. It can be really important to have the words Indigenous women in a paragraph where we're talking about provision of healthcare in rural and remote areas, because there's a specific area that needs specific attention. And so the visibility there can be really important. But the flip side to that is that the minute we start using the list, we are going to lose LGBTI off it first thing. And then the second thing we will often lose is disability or something similar. So the list gets smaller and smaller and smaller, partly in the interests of that issue around readability of the document. And so there is this tension around, do we make people visible in the document, or do we recognise diversity in the document? National sovereignty keeps creeping in. So there's always a bit where the more conservative states want to say, all of this is subject to our national interests or our national context or our cultural context. And the underlying debate there is about to what degree can an agreement from the UN override the national sovereignty of a state? To what degree can the UN tell people what to do? And of course, the answer is it can't. UN documents are unenforceable in a traditional sense, unless we're talking about some fairly serious Security Council stuff. But that debate around whether in agreeing to the agreed conclusions, so that debate will stop at 5 a.m. in the morning and everyone can go home, you are agreeing to do things that your state might not want to do. So sovereignty is a key issue. And then the other one, and this one is the nasty one, which is really live, has built exponentially since the last time we did CSW in person. It used to be that abortion was the really huge issue. Abortion is still huge and will be much bigger this time because we'll be physically in the US, where there's been so much movement in that space lately. That sort of protest can be everything from large numbers of people turning up to your parallel event with predetermined questions about the murder of babies, and then completely monopolising your question and answer time. Bombing online events with inappropriate material, all the way through to large campaigns that are well resourced with double-decker buses with pictures of fetuses on the side that are parked out the front of the UN for the entire 2-week period as the traffic fines mount up on their front window. So it's confronting, and you might find that you are grabbed in the corridor by people, and you should always feel, if at any point you are uncomfortable with a conversation you are having at CSW, you should always feel able to walk away from that. And if you don't, you're entitled to make a fuss until somebody puts you in a position where you are able to walk away. You should not be having to be trapped into conversations where you might be having to discuss abortion, where you might be a person who has had an abortion yourself, or where you are being asked about consent, where you are somebody who has experienced sexual violence yourself. So watch out for your own people. Try, if you can, to be aware of who might have sensitivities in particular areas, and just make sure that you've got an eye on where everybody is and whether they're okay. I've had to rescue people in the past, and it's never anything obvious, but it can be subtly brutal. I once had to rescue a YWCA delegation of young women, all of whom were under 25, I think, the people who were there, who were wearing T-shirts which simply said, young women's human rights or something like that, who were sitting along a corridor, only to have a much older group of American women come and put chairs around them and sit on the chairs so that they couldn't get away. And so they were literally hemmed in and trapped. And the older women, when I approached them, said that what they were doing was hiding the message on their T-shirts. And I pointed out they were in fact falsely imprisoning those women, and then started to film them. And at that point, they moved away. But that sort of thing does happen. And I expect it to start happening now in relation to the issue of gender and sex. Gender is a discussion around the way women exist in the world. It covers the experiences of people of diverse genders and people who have moved between genders. So trans, anyone who is non-binary, anyone who is gender fluid, anyone who comes from a marginalised gender is covered by that term. And the preferred term that we're using at CSW is gender, because it describes the way you live in the world, not the body you have. Now, there will be times when it's more appropriate for us to use the term sex because we are talking about discrimination on the basis of what body you have. So we might talk about sex in relation to provision of healthcare for reproductive purposes. But we will talk about gender when we're talking about housing, because it's about how you live in the world, not about what body you've got. You will see very strong pushback against gender language and a preference for language around sex, sex data versus gender data. Our default position is that in some circumstances it's entirely appropriate to collect sex data, particularly if it's around reproductive health and other bodily related issues. But that gender data is more likely to produce the sort of results in most cases that we're looking at that we want to get. So we might be collecting sex data, we might be collecting gender data, but the people who oppose particularly trans inclusion in the space will have an issue with gender data and will prefer the term sex data. Sex-based rights is another term you might hear. Lots of stuff about the definition of woman. You've probably seen TikTok clips from blokes approaching women at rallies and saying, define a woman, completely missing the point that it's actually a very complex category that we're talking about when we talk about women. So you'll hear that sort of stuff on a fairly regular basis. But you will also be surrounded by people who will go into bat on those issues. And if at any point you're uncomfortable, as I say, just remove yourself from that place. Or if you can't, find someone who can help you, even if that means shouting out. So that's a whistle stop through some of the language issues. Any questions about any of that? Because we're well over our time. Anything anyone would like to raise? Okay, well, in that case, I'm going to wrap that one up there. But having started you on that journey about thinking about what's your domestic advocacy and how does it work in this space, very happy to